how one mechanic's illegal Jeep mod saved hundreds of lives at Monte Cassino. In February of 1944, the mountains of southern Italy became a tomb of mud and iron. Rain fell without mercy across the Liri Valley, transforming roads into rivers, foxholes into cisterns, and the ancient stone walls of Monte Cassino into a fortress that seemed to mock the very idea of modern warfare. For 3 months, Allied forces had thrown themselves against the Gustav Line, that fearsome belt of German defensive positions stretching across the Italian peninsula, and for 3 months, the mountain held. The monastery atop Monte Cassino, built in the 6th century by Saint Benedict himself, overlooked the valley like a sentinel from another age. Beneath its walls, in terrain that consumed men and machines with equal appetite, the American Fifth Army and British Eighth Army found themselves locked in a nightmare of attrition. Artillery fire echoed through the limestone peaks day and night, a thunder that never ceased, punctuated by the sharper crack of rifle fire and the dull crump of mortars dropping into positions that had been taken, lost, and retaken a dozen times. The weather in that winter was biblical. Rain fell in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to 20 yards. The dirt roads leading up to the front lines, never more than farm tracks to begin with, dissolved into channels of ochre mud that swallowed trucks to their axles. Engineers laid corduroy roads, logs placed crosswise to provide traction, and watched them disappear beneath the mire within hours. Ambulances attempting to evacuate wounded men from forward aid stations became stuck so frequently that litter bearers had to carry casualties on foot, 4 men to a stretcher, slipping and stumbling through knee-deep sludge for miles. In this chaos of collapsing logistics, the wounded accumulated. Field hospitals established in farmhouses, barns, and hasty tent complexes worked around the clock. Surgeons operated in conditions that would have been unthinkable in civilian practice. The air inside the surgical tents smelled of ether, blood, and the acrid bite of carbolic disinfectant. Canvas walls snapped and shuddered in the wind. Rain hammered on fabric roofs with a sound like machine gun fire. And beneath it all, like a heartbeat, the steady throb of gasoline-powered generators provided the electricity that made modern battlefield medicine possible. Portable generators had revolutionized forward medical care during World War II. Before them, surgery at the front meant working by lantern light, with all the limitations that imposed. But with a reliable generator, a field hospital could power surgical lamps, suction pumps, sterilization equipment, and communication radios. The difference between light and darkness was the difference between life and death for hundreds of men every day. But generators, like everything else in that sodden February, were failing. The Army's standard field generators were temperamental machines even under ideal conditions. They required constant maintenance, clean fuel, and regular replacement of spark plugs and belts. In the mud of Monte Cassino, where everything corroded and nothing stayed clean, they broke down with an alarming frequency. Fuel convoys that should have reached forward positions every 2 days were delayed by impassable roads. When fuel did arrive, it was often contaminated with water from improper storage. Generators sputtered, coughed, and died in the middle of operations, plunging surgical tents into darkness while doctors held retractors inside open abdomens, waiting desperately for the lights to return. The mechanics assigned to maintain these generators worked without rest. They stood in the rain, tools slipping in oil-slicked hands, trying to coax life back into machines that had been pushed far beyond their design limits. They scrounged parts from wrecked vehicles. They improvised repairs with wire and tape. And still, the generators failed. On the night of February 16th, during one of the heaviest artillery barrages of the campaign, the main generator at the 38th Evacuation Hospital failed completely. The surgical unit went dark. 4 operations were in progress. Men lay open on tables, their lives hanging in the balance, and the only light came from battery-powered lanterns that would last perhaps 20 minutes. Nurses held flashlights. Surgeons worked by feel as much as sight, their hands moving in shadows, racing against time and bleeding in shock. The backup generator wouldn't start. The mechanics tried for 40 minutes, cycling the starter until the battery died. They hand-cranked the engine, they checked the fuel line, cleaned the carburetor, replaced the spark plugs. Nothing worked. The generator's magneto had burned out, a catastrophic failure that couldn't be field repaired. 3 men died on the tables that night. not from unsurvivable wounds, but from complications that might have been caught and corrected if the surgeons had been able to see properly. One soldier, a private from Ohio, bled out from a severed artery that the surgeon couldn't find in the dim lantern light until it was too late. Another went into shock that wasn't recognized until his pulse became thready and weak. The third simply stopped breathing while the anesthesiologist was trying to ventilate him manually without the suction equipment needed to clear his airway. When dawn came, and emergency power was finally restored from a generator pulled from another unit 5 miles away, the chief surgeon, Major William Hastings, sat on a supply crate outside the surgical tent with his head in his hands. His scrubs were soaked with blood and rain. He had been operating for 14 hours straight, and 3 of his patients had died because he didn't have light. It was in this moment of exhausted despair that the problem became not just urgent, but personal. Among the mechanics who had worked through that terrible night was a 31-year-old staff sergeant named Frank DeLuca. He was a stocky man, 5'9", with broad shoulders and hands that showed the permanent staining of someone who had worked with engines his entire adult life. He had dark hair, olive skin that spoke to his Sicilian heritage, and eyes that always seemed to be evaluating how things worked, breaking down machines into their component parts, even while standing still. DeLuca came from Newark, New Jersey, from a neighborhood where Italian and Polish and Irish immigrants lived in tight-packed apartment buildings, and everyone knew everyone else's business. His father had worked in a textile mill. His mother took in sewing. Frank had been the first in his family to finish high school, and he'd done it while working 30 hours a week at Moretti's Auto Electric, a small garage on Ferry Street that specialized in repairing the electrical systems of cars and trucks. By the time he was 21, Frank DeLuca could diagnose a faulty generator by the sound it made. He understood voltage regulators, alternators, starter motors, and the delicate dance of brushes and commutators that made electrical systems work. He could rebuild a generator from salvaged parts and make it run smoother than it had from the factory. In peacetime, this made him valuable. In war, it made him indispensable. He had been drafted in early 1942, shortly after Pearl Harbor, and because of his electrical background, he was assigned to the 10th Engineer Battalion as a maintenance specialist. The Army trained him in military vehicle repair, taught him to work on everything from motorcycles to half-tracks, and then shipped him to North Africa in time for the Tunisia campaign. He had landed in Sicily, fought his way up through southern Italy, and arrived at Monte Cassino in January as part of the engineering support for the 5th Army's assault divisions. DeLuca had seen generators fail before. It was a constant problem, but watching men die because the lights went out affected him in a way that transcended his normal professional frustration. He had stood outside the surgical tent that night, helpless, listening to the urgent voices of doctors and the quiet moaning of wounded men, knowing that somewhere in the heaps of destroyed equipment scattered across the battlefield was the solution to this problem, if only he could think of it. The morning after the generator failure, DeLuca walked through the motor pool where his unit maintained vehicles. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a gray sky and a landscape of puddles that reflected the broken world. The motor pool was a sea of mud studded with disabled vehicles, jeeps with blown engines, trucks with shattered axles, half-tracks stripped for parts, all the mechanical detritus of modern warfare, waiting to be repaired, cannibalized, or written off as total losses. DeLuca stopped beside a Willys MB Jeep that had taken a mortar fragment through its radiator. The vehicle was a write-off for transportation purposes. The frame was bent, the front axle cracked, but the engine was intact. He stood there for a long moment, rain dripping from his helmet, looking at that engine. The Willys Jeep was powered by a Go Devil engine, a simple but robust 4-cylinder unit that produced 60 horsepower. It was designed for reliability rather than performance, built to run on low-octane fuel and withstand the kind of abuse that military service guaranteed. DeLuca knew these engines intimately. He had rebuilt dozens of them, and as he stood there in the mud, an idea began to form. An generator was just an engine coupled to an electrical producing device. The Army's field generators used small single-cylinder or two-cylinder engines, typically producing between 5 and 10 kilowatts of power. But a Jeep engine, properly set up, could produce significantly more. The challenge was converting the mechanical energy of the engine's rotation into electrical current at the right voltage and frequency. In theory, it was possible. In practice, it would require fabricating mounting brackets, finding or building a suitable alternator, creating a system to regulate voltage, and somehow doing all of this with whatever parts could be scrounged from the wreckage around them. It would also require bypassing official channels, because the Army had strict regulations about modifying vehicles and even stricter regulations about using equipment for purposes other than those specified in the technical manuals. DeLuca knew he should submit the idea through proper channels, fill out forms, write a proposal, and wait for it to work its way up through battalion, regiment, division, and corps headquarters, where it would likely be rejected by someone who had never been within 10 miles of the front lines. Instead, he went to find his commanding officer. Captain Gerald Morrison commanded the maintenance company of the 10th Engineer Battalion. He was a West Point graduate, 34 years old, with a reputation for being by the book to a fault. Morrison believed in regulations, procedures, and the chain of command. He believed that the Army functioned because men followed orders, not because they improvised solutions in violation of established doctrine. When DeLuca presented his idea to convert damaged Jeep engines into auxiliary generators for the medical units, Morrison's response was immediate and negative. "Sergeant, those vehicles are Army property. They're already written up as combat losses, which means they're going to be evaluated by salvage teams and either repaired or stripped for parts according to doctrine. You don't have authorization to modify them."
"Sir, with respect, those Jeeps are sitting in mud doing nothing. The medical units are running on generators that fail every other day. If we could—" "No." Morrison's voice was flat. "You have your assigned duties, Sergeant, maintaining operational vehicles, not building unauthorized equipment from destroyed ones. The engineers at corps level design field equipment. That's their job. Your job is to turn wrenches on the vehicles that are still running. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir." But DeLuca didn't stop thinking about it. Over the next 3 days, he watched 2 more generators fail at different medical units. He watched mechanics struggle to repair them with insufficient parts. He watched ambulances deliver loads of wounded men to hospitals that operated in partial darkness, conserving their generator fuel, running only essential equipment, making do. And he started gathering parts. He did it quietly, carefully during his off-duty hours. In the Army, there was a culture of scrounging, the informal network by which necessary items were acquired outside official channels. Every unit had men who knew how to trade, barter, or simply take what they needed from the vast piles of equipment that accumulated in rear areas. DeLuca wasn't a natural scrounger, but he learned quickly. From a destroyed British truck, he salvaged a heavy-duty alternator, the kind used to charge multiple batteries on large vehicles. From an American half-track with fire damage, he took a voltage regulator. Belt-driven pulleys came from a wrecked generator. Belts themselves were plentiful. He traded a bottle of liberated Italian wine for a box of them. Mounting brackets would have to be fabricated, which meant he needed access to a welding setup and metal stock. He found a welding rig at a corps-level maintenance depot 15 miles behind the lines. The depot was chaos, hundreds of vehicles in various states of repair, mechanics working in shifts around the clock, and a sergeant's hierarchy that controlled access to tools and equipment. DeLuca spent an afternoon there, ostensibly helping repair a truck, and in the process established a rapport with a sergeant named Hayes, who ran the welding section. I might need to do some off-book fabrication work. Small stuff. Brackets and frames. Nothing that would interfere with official work. Hayes, a rail-thin man from West Virginia with a sardonic sense of humor, looked at him steadily. What kind of brackets? Generator mount for a Jeep engine. Why would you need that? Because the field hospitals keep going dark and men keep dying. Hayes considered this. Then he nodded. Welding Bay 3 is always empty at night. I don't lock it. If someone was to use it after hours, I wouldn't know about it. And what I don't know about, I can't report. It was as close to official approval as DeLuca was going to get. He began working at night, after his official duties ended. He enlisted help from 2 other men in his unit. Corporal Jimmy Tartaglia, a motor pool mechanic from Brooklyn who could machine parts on a lathe, and Private Eddie Kowalski, a farm kid from Wisconsin who had a gift for understanding how mechanical systems fit together. Both men understood the risk they were taking. Unauthorized modification of military equipment could result in anything from an Article 15 disciplinary action to a full court-martial, especially if the modification resulted in damage or injury. But both men had also seen the consequences of generator failures, and both men trusted DeLuca. They pulled the engine from the destroyed Jeep on a cold night in late February. It took 4 hours of work in darkness, using only shrouded flashlights, to disconnect the motor mounts, transmission, and exhaust system, and then hoist the engine free using a block and tackle. They loaded it onto a handcart and pushed it through the mud to a supply shed that DeLuca had claimed as a workspace. The shed was barely large enough for the 3 of them in the engine. It had a dirt floor, plank walls, and a roof that leaked in 2 places. They covered the leaks with canvas and set up a work area using planks laid across crates. The engine sat in the middle of the space like an idol waiting to be consecrated. "All right," DeLuca said, looking at it. "Let's see if this works." The basic concept was straightforward. The Jeep engine would be mounted on a frame, its flywheel connected via belt to the alternator. The alternator would produce alternating current, which would be regulated to the standard military voltage of 120 volts at 60 Hz. The whole assembly would need to be mobile, capable of being towed or loaded onto a truck, and robust enough to operate under field conditions. The devil, as always, was in the details.
First, they needed a frame. Tartaglia fabricated one from steel channel stock, creating a rectangular base roughly 4 feet by 3 feet, with mounting points for the engine and alternator. The welds were crude but strong, reinforced at stress points. The frame had towing eyes at one end and could be fitted with wheels from a wrecked handcart. Mounting the engine proved challenging. The original Jeep motor mounts wouldn't work on the new frame, so they had to design custom mounts that would absorb vibration while keeping the engine stable. Kowalski solved this by using rubber bushings salvaged from truck suspension systems, mounting them between the engine and the frame with long bolts that could be tightened to adjust alignment. The alternator mount was even more complex. The alternator had to be positioned so that its pulley aligned precisely with the pulley on the engine's crankshaft. Misalignment would cause the belt to slip or break. They spent hours measuring, adjusting, testing, using string and straight edges to ensure everything lined up. When they finally bolted the alternator into place, it sat at an angle that looked wrong, but measured perfectly. Connecting the 2 components required a belt drive system. The engine's crankshaft pulley was small and fast spinning. The alternator pulley was larger, turning slower but producing more torque. The ratio mattered. Too fast, then the alternator would overheat. Too slow, and it wouldn't produce enough current. DeLuca calculated the proper ratio using formulas he remembered from his days at Moretti's, working out the math on scraps of paper by candlelight. They used a 2-belt system for redundancy. The belts were tensioned using an adjustable idler pulley that Kowalski designed, mounted on a spring-loaded arm that maintained constant pressure. It was crude, but it worked. The voltage regulation system was the most technically demanding part. The alternator produced raw AC current that varied with engine speed. To make it usable, they needed to regulate both voltage and frequency. The voltage regulator from the half-track helped with the first problem. For frequency control, they needed the engine to run at a constant speed regardless of electrical load. DeLuca engineered a governor system using springs and linkage from a truck carburetor connected to the Jeep engine's throttle. It was finicky and required careful adjustment, but once calibrated, it kept the engine running at a steady 1800 RPM, producing current at almost exactly 60 Hz. The entire assembly, when complete, looked like something built in a junkyard. Welded seams showed, paint was mismatched or absent, bolts were different sizes depending on what had been available, but when they poured fuel into the tank, primed the carburetor, and pulled the starter cord, the engine caught on the third pull, settled into a steady rumble, and the alternator began producing current. They tested it with a multimeter borrowed from the signal corps, 118 volts, 59 Hz. Close enough. "Holy hell," Tartaglia said, watching the needle on the meter. "It actually works." "Don't celebrate yet," DeLuca replied. "Let's see if it holds up under load." They spent the next 2 nights testing the system, running it for hours at a time, adding electrical loads to simulate actual use. They connected banks of lights, a field radio, even a small motor. The engine ran without complaint. The voltage stayed stable, the belts held, the whole assembly vibrated and clattered, louder than a standard generator, but it produced power. The only significant problem was heat. The engine got extremely hot without the Jeep's radiator and fan to cool it. They solved this by fabricating a water tank from a fuel can, mounting it above the engine, and using the original water pump to circulate coolant through the block. It was crude, requiring manual refilling every few hours, but it kept the engine temperature in safe ranges. By early March, they had a working prototype. It was ugly, loud, and entirely unauthorized, but it produced 15 kilowatts of continuous power, 3 times the output of a standard field generator, and could run for 12 hours on a single tank of fuel. Now they needed to test it in the field. The 38th Evacuation Hospital, where the fatal generator failure had occurred in February, was still operating under marginal power conditions. Their primary generator had been repaired, but it remained unreliable. The backup generator was a smaller unit borrowed from another hospital, insufficient to power all necessary equipment simultaneously. Surgeons continued to prioritize which lights to keep on, which suction pumps to run, which equipment to power down. DeLuca approached one of the surgeons he knew, a captain named Rossi, who had grown up in the same Newark neighborhood. They had recognized each other in January and had occasionally shared coffee when both men had time, talking about home, about Ferry Street and the old neighborhood, about anything except the war. "Tony," DeLuca said one evening, finding Rossi outside the surgical tent smoking a cigarette, "I need a favor." Rossi looked at him with tired eyes. "What kind of favor?" "I built something, an auxiliary generator. I need to test it under real conditions. If it works, it could solve your power problems." "If it works?" "It'll work. I just need to prove it." Rossi studied him for a long moment. "Is this authorized?" "Not exactly." "So, if someone finds out, we both get court-martialed?" "Probably." Rossi flicked his cigarette into the mud. "When do you want to do this?" "Tonight. We're expecting wounded from the 141st Infantry. They're pushing toward Casino Town. It's going to be a long night." "Bring it. But for God's sake, keep it quiet." They moved the generator into position after dark, parking it 50 feet from the surgical tent, far enough that the engine noise wouldn't interfere with operations, but close enough to run power cables. DeLuca and his team worked quickly, connecting the output to the hospital's distribution panel, making sure all connections were solid. At 8 p.m., wounded began arriving. The first ambulance brought 4 men, 2 with shrapnel wounds, 1 with a shattered femur, 1 with abdominal trauma. The surgical team moved into action, practiced and efficient despite exhaustion. The regular generator hummed in the background, powering lights and equipment. At 9:30, the regular generator stuttered, missed, and died. The lights went out. In the sudden darkness, someone swore. Battery lanterns clicked on, casting weak yellow light. Major Hastings, bent over a soldier's open chest cavity, froze mid-movement. "How long to get it restarted?" he called out. "Unknown, sir," came the reply from outside. "It's the fuel pump. Could be 5 minutes, could be an hour." Hastings looked up at the darkness, his face grim. Then he heard another sound, A rougher, louder engine starting outside. Lights flickered, then came back on, brighter than before. The suction pump resumed its rhythmic gurgle. The radio crackled back to life.
"What the hell?" Hastings said. Outside, DeLuca's converted Jeep engine hammered away, its alternator spinning, power flowing through cables into the hospital's electrical system. The voltage was steady. The lights were bright. And inside the surgical tent, Hastings resumed working, closing the incision that had nearly killed his patient when the lights failed. The operation lasted 3 more hours. During that time, 4 more wounded men came in. All of them were stabilized and treated under steady light. The improvised generator never faltered. When the regular generator was finally repaired and restarted just before midnight, DeLuca shut down his unit and waited. Major Hastings came out of the surgical tent an hour later, after the last patient had been moved to recovery. His surgical gown was stained dark with blood. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. When he saw DeLuca standing beside the strange apparatus that had saved his patients, he walked over slowly. "Did you build this?" "Yes, sir." "Is it authorized?" "No, sir." Hastings looked at the generator, at the jury-rigged assembly of engine and alternator and welded frame. Then he looked at DeLuca. "It's saved 4 lives tonight. Maybe 5. That last patient, the one with the chest wound. If the lights had stayed off, I would have lost him. I couldn't see enough to find the bleeding." DeLuca said nothing. "Don't take it down," Hastings said. "Leave it here. I want it as backup in case the main unit fails again." He paused. "And I don't give a damn if it's authorized. When someone asks, I'll tell them I requisitioned it." The next morning, Captain Morrison found out. He arrived at the hospital compound at 8 a.m., having been informed by someone in the motor pool that DeLuca had removed an engine from a destroyed Jeep without authorization. Morrison's face was tight with anger as he located DeLuca beside the improvised generator. "Sergeant, I gave you a direct order. No unauthorized modifications. No stripping vehicles for parts. What the hell is this?" "It's a generator, sir. It kept the hospital running last night when the regular unit failed." "I don't care what it did. You violated orders. You used Army property without authorization. You exposed this unit to disciplinary action." Morrison's voice rose. "Do you have any idea what this looks like? A sergeant deciding he knows better than his commanding officer? A mechanic playing engineer with equipment he has no authority to modify?" "Sir, you're going to dismantle this immediately. That's an order. And then you're going to report to Battalion S1 for disciplinary proceedings. I'm recommending an Article 15. Maybe that will teach you to follow orders." Major Hastings had been listening from inside the hospital tent. He emerged now, still in his surgical scrubs, walking towards Morrison with deliberate steps. "Major, I need to speak with you." Morrison turned. "Major, this doesn't concern you. This is a matter of—" "It concerns me completely. That generator kept my surgical unit operational last night. Without it, I would have lost patients. Your sergeant saved American lives. That doesn't excuse. I don't give a damn about excuses. I care about treating wounded soldiers. If your regulations prevent that, then your regulations are wrong." The 2 officers stood facing each other, neither backing down. Around them, the morning routine of the hospital continued. Nurses changing dressings, orderlies cleaning equipment, ambulances arriving with more wounded from the night's fighting. Finally, Morrison spoke. "This will have to go up the chain, Major. I can't overlook a direct violation of orders." "Then let it go up the chain. I'll testify that this equipment is essential to my unit's operations. I'll recommend Sergeant DeLuca for a commendation, not a court-martial." Morrison looked at DeLuca, then at the generator.
then back at Hastings. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The issue did go up the chain of command. DeLuca was summoned to battalion headquarters 2 days later to explain his actions to Lieutenant Colonel McKnight, the battalion commander. He brought drawings and specifications, prepared to defend his work. The meeting was brief. "Sergeant, I've read Major Hastings' report. I've also read Morrison's. They disagree on almost everything except one fact. Your generator works. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir." "Can you build more?" DeLuca hadn't expected that question. "Sir?"
I asked if you can build more. We have 17 medical units in this sector. If your design is reliable, I want them all equipped with backup generators. Yes, sir. With the right parts and some help, I could build more. You'll have both. I'm assigning you 2 additional mechanics and authorizing you to requisition whatever components you need from salvage yards. You're being detached from normal duties until further notice. Your new assignment is producing field generators. Captain Morrison will cooperate. McKnight's expression suggested that Morrison had already been spoken to on that point. Any questions? No, sir. Good. Start immediately. The spring offensive is coming, and we're going to have a lot more casualties. I want power systems that won't fail. Over the next 2 months, DeLuca and his expanded team built 12 more generators. They refined the design with each iteration, learning what worked and what didn't. They discovered that mounting the engine on rubber isolators reduced vibration. They found that adding a simple muffler made the units quieter without reducing efficiency. They developed a standardized parts list so that repairs could be made by any competent mechanic. Each generator was tested extensively before being delivered to a medical unit. Each one was paired with training. DeLuca personally taught hospital personnel how to operate and maintain the equipment. He wrote an informal technical manual, hand-drawn and mimeographed, explaining the system's operation and common troubleshooting procedures. The generators proved their worth during the 3rd and 4th battles of Monte Cassino. As Allied forces finally broke through the Gustav Line in May, casualties mounted. Medical units operated at maximum capacity, sometimes treating hundreds of wounded in a single day. The standard field generators continued to fail with regularity, victims of overuse, contaminated fuel, and harsh conditions. But DeLuca's converted Jeep engine generators ran almost continuously, providing reliable backup power that kept surgical theaters lit and equipment running. Word spread. Other units heard about the design. Engineers from the 34th Infantry Division visited to examine the generators and took the specifications back to their own maintenance shops. A major from Corps headquarters spent an afternoon with DeLuca, asking detailed questions about voltage regulation and load capacity, taking notes that would eventually work their way into official Army technical documentation. By June, as Allied forces pushed north from the ruins of Monte Cassino toward Rome, variations of DeLuca's design were operating at medical units throughout the Italian theater. Some were built by dedicated teams like DeLuca's. Others were improvised by unit mechanics using local materials. The design was flexible enough to accommodate different alternators, different mounting configurations, different available parts. The core concept that a Jeep engine could be converted into a reliable high-output generator had been proven beyond doubt. Frank DeLuca was promoted to Technical Sergeant in June and awarded the Bronze Star in July. The citation mentioned his technical innovation and dedication to duty in support of medical operations. It didn't mention that he had disobeyed orders, violated regulations, or built the first generator without authorization. By that point, the results spoke loudly enough that the methods were forgiven. But DeLuca took little satisfaction from the recognition. He had seen too much by then. The fall of Rome in early June had been followed by the grinding advance through central Italy, a campaign of small, bitter battles for towns and ridgelines whose names would be forgotten by history. He had watched his improvised generators keep field hospitals running through it all, but he had also watched those hospitals fill with mangled men, boys really, 19 and 20 years old, torn apart by shells and machine guns and mines. He had learned that solving one problem only revealed the next. Reliable power meant surgeons could operate more effectively, which meant more wounded survived initial treatment, which meant more men lingered for days or weeks with injuries that would have been quickly fatal in earlier wars, suffering through amputations and infections and slow recoveries in hospital tents that smelled of gangrene and despair. Innovation, DeLuca understood, was not heroism. It was necessity driven by crisis. He had built generators because men were dying in the dark. The generators worked, and that was good, but the war continued, and men kept dying, and all the generators in the world couldn't stop that. In August, he was transferred to a depot near Naples, tasked with standardizing the generator design and training other mechanics in its construction. It was quieter work, further from the front lines, and it gave him time to think. He wrote letters home to Newark, to his parents and younger sister, saying little about what he did and less about what he had seen. The letters home from Newark spoke of jobs waiting at Moretti's garage when he returned, of neighborhood news, of his mother's continued prayers for his safe return. The war in Italy ground on without him. Allied forces continued their advance, first to the Gothic line, then into the Po Valley. DeLuca's generators went with them, mounted on trucks, towed behind jeeps, operated by medics and engineers who never knew the name of the man who had first figured out how to convert a wrecked vehicle into a life-saving tool.
A Signal Corps photographer arrived at the Naples depot to document one of the generators for an Army technical bulletin. DeLuca stood beside the machine, uncomfortable in a clean uniform, while the photographer arranged the shot. The resulting photograph showed a serious-faced sergeant standing next to a mechanical assembly that looked exactly like what it was, a Jeep engine bolted to a frame with an alternator attached. The photograph was published in an internal Army engineering journal with a brief caption describing the unit's specifications and performance. DeLuca's name appeared once, in small print. The article was read by perhaps 500 people, filed and forgotten. But the generators themselves continued to proliferate. By the end of 1944, variations of the design were operating in Italy, France, Belgium, and Germany. Engineers adapted the concept to use different engine types, truck engines, tank engines, even captured German vehicle engines when Allied equipment was scarce. The fundamental insight remained the same. Existing military vehicles contained powerful engines that could be repurposed for electrical generation when those vehicles were damaged beyond repair for transportation. The impact was difficult to quantify. How do you measure lives saved by having reliable power? How do you count the operations that succeeded instead of failing, the patients who lived instead of dying, the subtle difference between adequate light and inadequate light at the critical moment when a surgeon's hands moved inside a wounded body? The Army's own assessments, compiled after the war, estimated that improved field power systems contributed to a measurable reduction in surgical mortality rates during 1944 and 1945. Wounded soldiers who reached a field hospital had approximately a 4% better chance of survival in late 1944 compared to early 1943. Multiple factors contributed to this improvement: better surgical techniques, improved blood storage, faster evacuation times, but reliable electrical power was among them. Frank DeLuca's contribution was one thread in a larger tapestry. The war was won by millions of individual actions, most of them unrecorded, performed by men and women whose names appeared in no histories. The mechanic who kept trucks running, the clerk who ensured supplies reached the right units, the cook who kept soldiers fed, the medic who carried wounded men out of danger, the engineer who built bridges under fire, the radio man who maintained communications, all of them essential, all of them forgotten. DeLuca understood this. When the war ended in May 1945, he felt no particular sense of accomplishment. He had done his job, nothing more. That the job had involved creating something new was almost incidental. He had seen a problem, understood how to solve it, and applied skills learned in a garage on Ferry Street to circumstances that his employers at Moretti's Auto Electric could never have imagined. He returned to Newark in September 1945, discharged with the rank of technical sergeant and a Bronze Star he kept in a drawer and rarely mentioned. He went back to work at Moretti's garage. The owner, Mr. Moretti, now elderly and failing, was glad to have him back. Frank resumed repairing generators, rebuilding starters, rewiring electrical systems on cars and trucks. His life resumed its pre-war rhythms. He married in 1947 a woman named Angela, who had grown up 3 blocks away. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and bought a small house in a neighborhood that was beginning to move out toward the suburbs. He worked at the garage for 30 years, eventually buying it when Mr. Moretti retired in 1975, running it as DeLuca's Auto Electric until his own retirement. He spoke little about the war. When his children asked, he told them he had been a mechanic in Italy, which was true, and left it at that. He attended reunions of the 10th Engineer Battalion occasionally in the early years, but the men he had worked most closely with, Tartaglia and Kowalski, had scattered to different parts of the country, and as time passed, the reunions became less frequent and finally stopped altogether. The generators he had built were forgotten almost as quickly as they were decommissioned. After the war, the Army standardized its field power equipment. Engineers designed purpose-built generators with proper mounting systems, efficient engines, and reliable components. The improvised Jeep engine generators were scrapped, sold as surplus, or simply abandoned in depot yards across Europe. None were preserved. The technical bulletins that described them were filed in archives and eventually transferred to microfilm, where they gathered digital dust, accessible only to researchers who knew what they were looking for. But the concept survived. During the Korean War, when American forces found themselves fighting in mountainous terrain that made supply difficult and generator failures common, maintenance units once again began converting engines into auxiliary power sources. The designs were more sophisticated than DeLuca's original work, but the underlying principle was identical. When standard equipment failed and men's lives depended on electricity, mechanics improvised. In Vietnam, the same pattern repeated. Field hospitals in remote locations, supplied by helicopter and dependent on generators that struggled in tropical humidity, were supported by converted engine generator sets built by engineers who probably never heard of Frank DeLuca, but who were solving the same problems he had faced 20 years earlier. The principle became embedded in military doctrine, though never officially acknowledged. Field manuals began including sections on emergency power generation from alternate sources. Engineer training incorporated lessons on adapting existing equipment for new purposes. The idea that a vehicle engine could serve multiple functions, transportation when the vehicle was operational, power generation when it wasn't, became an assumed part of logistics planning. Modern military power systems owe a debt to those early improvisations, though the lineage is impossible to trace directly. Today's mobile generators are sophisticated machines, diesel-powered and computer-controlled, capable of producing stable power under extreme conditions. But the underlying need, reliable electricity at the front lines, remains unchanged from what Major Hastings faced in that surgical tent in February 1944. The connection extends beyond the military. Modern disaster relief operations depend on mobile power systems that are conceptual descendants of wartime innovations. When hurricanes knock out electrical grids, when earthquakes destroy infrastructure, when floods isolate communities, relief organizations deploy generators that share a common ancestor with DeLuca's improvised Jeep engine unit. The specifics have changed. Better engines, better voltage regulation, better portability. But the fundamental solution to the problem of providing power in crisis conditions was worked out in places like Monte Cassino by men like Frank DeLuca, who understood machines and refused to accept that regulations mattered more than lives.
Frank DeLuca died in 1994, at the age of 81, of complications from emphysema. His obituary in the Newark Star-Ledger was brief, mentioning his service in World War II, his ownership of an auto repair business, and his survival by his wife, 2 children, and 5 grandchildren. There was no mention of generators or field hospitals, or the nights he had spent in a leaking shed in Italy, building something that the Army said he shouldn't build. His son, clearing out the garage after Frank's death, found a box of papers in a back office. Among them were the hand-drawn schematics for the generator design, now brown with age, the pencil lines faded but still legible. There were photographs too, black and white images showing the generators in operation at field hospitals, the machines barely visible in backgrounds dominated by tents and mud and tired-looking soldiers. And there was a copy of the technical bulletin from 1944, the one with Frank standing beside his creation, looking uncomfortable and slightly defiant, his hands in his pockets, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the camera. The son, who had never known the full story of what his father had done, kept the papers. They sit now in a folder in an attic in New Jersey, preserved not because anyone thinks they're historically important, but because they belonged to a father and seemed worth keeping. History is built from such fragments. The official records of World War II fill archives. Thousands of linear feet of documents detailing troop movements, supply expenditures, casualty figures, and command decisions. Those records tell the story of the war at a macro level, the view from headquarters, the perspective of generals and planners. But there is another history, harder to capture, made up of individual moments of innovation, frustration, fear, and determination. The sergeant who figured out how to make something work. The doctor who saved a life in impossible conditions. The soldier who kept going when everything said to stop. These stories exist in fragments, a photograph, a letter, a faded document in an attic box, and they tell a truth that the official histories often miss. The truth is that wars are not won by grand strategies alone. They are won by mechanics in the mud, by surgeons in the dark, by people who see problems and solve them because the alternative is unacceptable. Frank DeLuca's generators did not win the war. They did not change strategic outcomes or alter the course of battles. What they did was keep lights on when lights were needed, and in doing so they gave surgeons the ability to see clearly enough to save lives that would otherwise have been lost. That contribution is simultaneously immense and invisible. Immense because each life saved was a complete universe, a soldier who went home, married, had children, lived a full span of years that he would not have lived if he had died in a dark surgical tent in Italy. Invisible because there is no way to count those lives, no roster of men who survived because a generator kept running, no memorial to the mechanical ingenuity that made modern battlefield medicine possible. Monte Cassino, today, is a place of pilgrimage and remembrance. The monastery has been rebuilt, restored to its ancient grandeur after the destruction of 1944.
The mountainside is dotted with memorials, British, Polish, French, German, American, marking the sacrifice of the thousands who died there. Tourists walk the paths where soldiers once fought, looking out over the Leary Valley, trying to imagine what the battle was like. There is no memorial to Frank DeLuca, no plaque marking the spot where his first generator hummed to life, no museum exhibit explaining how a mechanic from Newark solved a problem that was killing wounded soldiers. History has moved on, as it always does, leaving behind only the largest monuments and the most famous names. But in the broader sweep of technological development, in the evolution of field medical care, in the military's growing understanding that improvisation and innovation must be encouraged rather than suppressed, Frank DeLuca's work left a mark. Not a visible mark, not one that can be pointed to and measured, but a mark nonetheless. The Jeep engine generators that proliferated through the Italian campaign and later through France and Germany represented something larger than their immediate function. They represented a shift in thinking about military equipment. Before the war, military technology was largely standardized and purpose-built. Equipment had specific functions, defined by technical manuals, and deviation from those functions was discouraged. The idea that a vehicle engine could become a generator, that battlefield wreckage could be transformed into life-saving equipment, that soldiers in the field might understand their needs better than engineers in rear areas, these ideas challenged established doctrine. The success of improvised generators and hundreds of similar innovations born from battlefield necessity gradually changed how the military thought about equipment and innovation. Post-war doctrine increasingly emphasized adaptability and field modification. Technical manuals began including sections on emergency procedures and alternative uses for standard equipment. Training programs started teaching soldiers not just to operate equipment, but to understand it well enough to adapt it when circumstances required. This shift was not revolutionary. It happened slowly, driven by accumulated experience rather than policy decisions. But it happened, and Frank DeLuca's work in that shed in Italy was part of the process. He proved that a mechanic with a good idea could solve a problem that was beyond the capacity of the official supply system. He demonstrated that innovation didn't require authorization, just knowledge and determination. And he showed that sometimes the best solution to a military problem came not from engineers and planners, but from someone who understood both the problem and the available resources well enough to bridge the gap between them. The broader lesson, applicable far beyond military contexts, is that expertise matters more than authority. Frank DeLuca knew engines. He understood electrical systems. He had spent years developing practical knowledge of how mechanical and electrical components work together. When he saw the problem of failing generators, he didn't need to be told what to do. He knew what to do. The challenge was not technical, but institutional. Convincing an organization built on hierarchy and regulations that his solution was worth implementing. That he succeeded is partly a testament to his persistence and partly a recognition that in war, results matter more than procedures. Major Hastings understood this. The surgeons who testified on DeLuca's behalf understood this. Even Lieutenant Colonel McKnight, authorizing the production of more generators, understood that saving lives justified bending rules.
In peacetime, DeLuca's actions might have resulted in punishment. He had, after all, violated direct orders and used military property without authorization. But war operates under different calculus. The cost of following rules had to be weighed against the cost of breaking them, and when the cost of following rules was measured in lives lost, the rules became negotiable. This creates a tension that organizations struggle with constantly. How do you maintain necessary discipline and standardization while also encouraging innovation and adaptability? How do you give people freedom to solve problems without creating chaos? The military's answer,
worked out over decades of experience, is to establish clear standards for normal operations while creating mechanisms for exception when circumstances warrant. Field expedient modifications, battlefield innovations, and emergency procedures are now recognized parts of military doctrine. Soldiers are trained to think creatively about solving problems with available resources. Officers are taught to evaluate innovations based on results rather than adherence to regulations. The balance is imperfect, and the tension between standardization and improvisation remains, but the principle that good ideas can come from anywhere in the organization is now established. Frank DeLuca helped establish that principle, though he never intended to and probably never realized he had. He was not trying to reform military thinking. He was trying to keep lights on in a hospital. The broader implications of his work only became clear in retrospect, as historians and military analysts looked back at World War II and tried to understand what lessons could be drawn from the experience. One of those lessons is that the most important innovations often come from people closest to the problems. DeLuca saw generators fail because he was standing there when they failed. He understood what was needed because he understood the machines involved. He could design a solution because he had the practical knowledge to bridge theory and reality. Someone sitting in a headquarters 200 miles away with access to better resources and more authority could not have done what he did because they didn't have his knowledge and they weren't there to see the problem firsthand. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Tank crews modified their vehicles to add armor and improve visibility. Infantry soldiers developed new tactics for clearing buildings and fighting in hedgerows. Pilots figured out better formations and attack techniques. Medics invented new procedures for treating wounds under field conditions. None of these innovations were ordered from above. They emerged from the bottom up, from people who faced problems and solved them with whatever tools and knowledge they had available. The best military organizations then and now recognize this and create systems to capture and disseminate field innovations. Technical intelligence teams interview soldiers to learn what works and what doesn't. After-action reports document successful improvisations. Training programs incorporate lessons learned from combat experience. The goal is to create a learning organization that can adapt faster than the enemy, constantly improving based on feedback from people on the front lines. Frank DeLuca's generators were part of this process. His work was documented, studied, replicated, and eventually incorporated into standard procedures. The specific design became obsolete as better generators were developed, but the concept that vehicle engines could be repurposed for power generation became part of the military's technological toolkit. That toolkit continues to expand. Modern military forces have access to technologies that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944. Satellite communications, night vision equipment, precision-guided munitions, unmanned aerial vehicles, the list goes on. But beneath all the advanced technology, the basic challenges remain the same. Soldiers still need food, water, shelter, and medical care. Equipment still breaks down. Supply lines still get disrupted. And when standard solutions fail, people still need to improvise. The difference between success and failure in those moments often comes down to whether the people involved have the knowledge, tools, and authority to innovate. DeLuca had the knowledge and tools. He lacked the authority, so he innovated anyway and faced the consequences. The fact that the consequences were ultimately positive, recognition rather than punishment, validated his decision, but it was a near thing. Captain Morrison had been ready to court-martial him. If the generator had failed, or if Major Hastings had not been willing to testify on his behalf, the story might have ended very differently. This highlights a fundamental question about innovation in organizations. How much risk should individuals be allowed to take when improvising solutions? If DeLuca's generator had failed during an operation, causing a patient's death, would his initiative still have been laudable? Would the Army still have recognized his contribution, or would he have been blamed for stepping outside his authority? There are no easy answers to these questions. Organizations need both discipline and flexibility, both standardization and innovation. The balance point depends on circumstances. In crisis, and war is the ultimate crisis, the balance shifts towards flexibility. In peacetime, it shifts back towards standardization. But finding the right balance is an ongoing challenge that every organization faces. What can be said with certainty is that Frank DeLuca made the right decision for his circumstances. The generators were needed, he had the knowledge to build them, the official channels had failed to provide a solution. His choice to proceed without authorization was justified by the results, and his willingness to accept personal risk for the benefit of others was the essence of what military service demands. His story is, in the end, a small story about a large war. It does not change our understanding of major campaigns or strategic decisions. It does not alter the timeline of events or the outcome of battles. What it does is illuminate how wars are actually fought, not just by generals and armies, but by individuals making decisions, solving problems, doing whatever is necessary to accomplish the mission.
That mission at Monte Cassino in February 1944 was saving the lives of wounded soldiers. Everything else, the regulations, the chain of command, the technical specifications, was secondary to that fundamental purpose. Frank DeLuca understood this instinctively. He built generators not because he wanted recognition or advancement, but because men were dying in the dark and he knew how to bring light. In that choice, made in a shed in Italy while rain fell on a devastated landscape, he embodied something essential about human nature. We are tool makers and problem solvers. When faced with challenges, we adapt, improvise, and create. These abilities, refined over millennia of human history, found expression in a converted Jeep engine that hummed through the night, powering lights that allowed surgeons to see clearly enough to save lives. The generators themselves are gone now, scrapped or rusted away decades ago. The men who built them and operated them are mostly gone too, their generation fading into history. But the principle they represented, that practical knowledge applied to pressing problems can save lives, remains as relevant as ever. In hospitals today, in disaster zones, in remote areas where infrastructure is poor or non-existent, people still face the challenge of providing reliable power to equipment that saves lives. The solutions are more sophisticated than DeLuca's Jeep engine generators, but the need is the same. Surgeons still need light. Equipment still needs electricity. When standard systems fail, someone still needs to figure out how to keep things running. Those people, working today in circumstances DeLuca could never have imagined, are his inheritors. They may not know his name or his story, but they are solving the same kinds of problems with the same kind of practical ingenuity. They are the mechanics and engineers and medics who understand that the mission, saving lives, protecting people, making things work, matters more than following rules. This is Frank DeLuca's legacy. Not in the specific generators he built, but in the example he set. An example of seeing problems clearly, understanding available resources, and having the courage to act when action is necessary. An example of practical knowledge applied with skill and determination. An example of doing what needs to be done regardless of whether anyone notices or remembers. History remembers the famous, the powerful, the dramatic. It remembers the battles and the generals, the speeches and the turning points. But history is made just as much by the unknown. The ordinary people who show up and do their jobs and solve the problems in front of them with whatever tools they have at hand. Frank DeLuca was one of those people. A mechanic from Newark who found himself in Italy during the worst winter of the war and built something that saved lives. He didn't set out to change military doctrine or inspire future generations. He set out to keep the lights on in a hospital, and he succeeded. That success, multiplied across thousands of similar stories of innovation and improvisation,
helped win a war, and helped build the world we live in today. The generators hummed through the darkness, bringing light where there had been none, giving surgeons the ability to see, to work, to save lives. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not the regulations broken, or the orders disobeyed, or the recognition earned or denied. Just the simple fact that when the lights were needed, the lights came on. And in the history of human ingenuity, in the long record of people solving problems with skill and determination, that is achievement enough. A mechanic with grease-stained hands and a knowledge of engines, standing in the mud of Italy, making a machine that worked when it was needed most. No monuments mark his achievement, no textbooks tell his story. But the principle he embodied, that expertise and determination can solve problems that defeat bureaucracy, remains as relevant as ever. On that rainy February night in 1944, when his improvised generator started up and the lights came back on and surgery could continue. In the end, that is how wars are won, and how progress is made. Not through grand gestures or famous names, but through the accumulated effort of countless individuals doing what needs to be done, solving the problems in front of them, applying their knowledge and skill to the challenges of the moment. Frank DeLuca was one such individual, a mechanic from Newark who found himself in Italy during the worst winter of the war and built something that saved lives. He didn't set out to change military doctrine or inspire future generations. He set out to keep the lights on in a hospital. And he succeeded. That success, multiplied across thousands of similar stories of innovation and improvisation, helped win a war and helped build the world we live in today. The generators hummed through the darkness, bringing light where there had been none, giving surgeons the ability to see, to work, to save lives. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not the regulations broken, or the orders disobeyed, or the recognition earned or denied. Just the simple fact that when the lights were needed, the lights came on. And in the history of human ingenuity, in the long record of people solving problems with skill and determination, that is achievement enough. A mechanic with grease-stained hands and a knowledge of engines, standing in the mud of Italy, making a machine that worked when it was needed most. No monuments mark his achievement, no textbooks tell his story. But the principle he embodied, that expertise and determination can solve problems that defeat bureaucracy, remains as relevant as ever. On that rainy February night in 1944, when his improvised generator started up and the lights came back on and surgery could continue. In the end, that is how wars are won, and how progress is made. Not through grand gestures or famous names, but through the accumulated effort of countless individuals doing what needs to be done, solving the problems in front of them, applying their knowledge and skill to the challenges of the moment. Frank DeLuca was one such individual, a mechanic from Newark who found himself in Italy during the worst winter of the war and built something that saved lives. He didn't set out to change military doctrine or inspire future generations. He set out to keep the lights on in a hospital. And he succeeded. That success, multiplied across thousands of similar stories of innovation and improvisation, helped win a war and helped build the world we live in today. The generators hummed through the darkness, bringing light where there had been none, giving surgeons the ability to see, to work, to save lives. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not the regulations broken, or the orders disobeyed, or the recognition earned or denied. Just the simple fact that when the lights were needed,
the lights came on. And in the history of human ingenuity, in the long record of people solving problems with skill and determination, that is achievement enough. And in the lives saved, in the example set, in the quiet demonstration that one person with knowledge and courage can make a difference when it matters most, perhaps that is the only legacy that truly matters. Not fame or recognition, but the simple fact of having done something that needed to be done, having solved a problem that needed to be solved, having brought light to darkness when darkness threatened to consume everything. The war moved on. The world moved on. But somewhere in the accumulated wisdom of military organizations, in the procedures for field expedient power generation, in the doctrine that encourages innovation from the front lines, Frank DeLuca's work persists. Not as a named contribution, not as a famous invention, but as one thread among thousands that together form the fabric of how modern organizations learn and adapt and survive. And perhaps that is the most fitting memorial for a man who never sought fame, who returned home and went back to fixing generators in a garage in Newark, who kept his story quiet and lived his life without fanfare. His contribution was real. His impact was meaningful. His legacy continues in ways he never knew or would probably never have claimed. But it continues nonetheless, in every portable generator that brings power to a crisis, in every field hospital that stays lit through the night, in every life saved because someone figured out how to make the lights work when the official systems failed. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.